There is a particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. Vera Holloway knew it well. She had known it since she was 14 years old, standing in a Nebraska field with a rifle she'd borrowed from the wall, watching the horizon for whatever came next. She'd been tired like that through hard winters and dry summers and 2 years of slow debt accumulating like snow on a roof nobody got around to clearing. She carried that tiredness the way a working animal carries its load. Not dramatically, not with complaint, but with the particular economy of someone who has learned not to waste energy, resisting what cannot be changed. She was carrying it now on a westbound train through Montana in the second week of April, 1891. The car she rode in smelled of coal smoke and wool, and the lunch someone 4 rows back had eaten somewhere around Billings. The seat was hard. The window beside her had a crack that let in a thin, persistent thread of cold air, no matter how she shifted her coat. Outside, the land rolled past in long gray swells, the kind of country that didn't bother to make itself pretty for travelers. The mountains to the north still wore their winter snow. The grass in the lowlands was barely green, more the suggestion of green, a color that hadn't fully committed yet. Vera watched it without feeling much about it either way. In her hands was a letter. She had read it 5 times in the past 2 days, not because she expected it to reveal something new, but because she was the kind of person who read things carefully before acting on them, and acting on this particular letter. Boarding a train, crossing 3 state lines, arriving at the home of a man she had never met, felt like something that deserved more than one reading. The paper was good quality, not showy, just solid, the kind a man buys because he wants the thing to last, not because he wants to impress. The handwriting was plain and consistent, no flourishes, no unnecessary spaces. Someone who wrote the way they probably worked, directly and without decoration. Miss Holloway, I make no promises except fairness. If you come and find this is not where you belong, I will arrange your passage home. No obligation on your part. C. Whitmore. She folded it for the 5th time and put it back in her coat pocket. Men who sent for mail-order brides did not usually write like that. They wrote about houses and land and the fine life waiting in the territory. They wrote about their Christian values and their steady income. Sometimes they wrote about loneliness in ways that were meant to be moving but ended up being uncomfortable to read. They promised things. It was, after all, a transaction built on promises. Cade Whitmore had promised her one word: fairness. Vera turned that word over in her mind the way she might turn over a coin she couldn't quite identify. Something about the weight of it felt off, but not dishonest, just unusual, like a warning delivered in a courteous voice. She had not come to Montana because she wanted to. That was the truth, and Vera Holloway had spent 26 years holding hard to the truth, even when something softer might have been easier to carry. The actual story was simpler and less flattering than whatever version she might have told a stranger. Their father, Martin Holloway, had died 2 years ago in late autumn. A stroke, sudden and complete. The kind that doesn't give a man time to settle his affairs, or say the things he probably should have said to the people who deserve to hear them. What he left behind was 31 acres of worked-out Nebraska farmland, one old mule named after a president, and a set of debts that Vera discovered only through the letters that began arriving a week after the funeral, polite and official, and entirely indifferent to grief. Her brother Fletcher had been gone since she was 14. He'd left for the Colorado silver mines on the premise that he'd come back wealthy, which he hadn't, and then on the premise that he'd come back soon, which he also hadn't. He sent money occasionally. He sent apologies more occasionally. And then in the fall following their father's death, he had appeared on their mother's porch with the particular combination of guilt and practicality that characterized most of what Fletcher did, and he had presented what he called a solution. There was a rancher in Montana, a man of means and reputation, a man, Fletcher said, with land and cattle and a solid operation in Silver Fork Valley, and a notice in a paper looking for a practical woman of good character. What Fletcher had not fully mentioned was that he had already written back on her behalf. "This is a way out for you and Mother," he had said, as if that settled it. Vera had been quiet for a long time, long enough that Fletcher started to look nervous, which he deserved. "You filled in my name," she'd said finally, "without asking me. I asked you last spring if you'd ever consider. You floated the idea while we were mending fence. That's not asking." Fletcher had the grace to look down. "I know. But Vera." Don't finish that sentence with "but Vera" and then say something about how you were trying to help. Either you respect that this is my life, or you don't. He'd looked at her then, really looked, which Fletcher didn't always do. "Do you have another plan?" She hadn't answered. Because the answer was no, and they both knew it, and saying it out loud would not have improved anything. She had taken 2 weeks, read the letter 7 times before this trip, done the math on what staying would cost and what going might buy. And then she had packed her trunk and said goodbye to her mother, who had held her hands and not cried because Ruth Holloway did not cry, where her children could see it, and boarded the train west. She was not a romantic. She had no particular expectation of happiness. What she wanted was a fair chance at a life that was worth the work it would take. And she was willing to travel a long way for that chance. The train began to slow. Through the window, a small depot materialized out of the gray morning, a wooden platform, a hand-painted sign, a horse rail with 2 animals tied to it. Beyond the platform, the valley opened up. Vera leaned slightly toward the glass. She had grown up in flat country. Nebraska had its own beauty, the kind that came from space and sky and the way light moved across open ground without obstruction. But she was not prepared for this. The valley was enormous. It lay between 2 mountain walls like something carved, deliberately shaped by forces that had no interest in human scale. The mountains to the east still carried their snow in long, bright streaks down the upper faces. But below the timberline, the slopes were dark with pine, and below that the land opened into grassland and pasture that caught the thin April light and held it like water in a shallow bowl. A river ran through the center of it all, silver gray and quick, bending around a stand of cottonwoods whose new leaves were just beginning to show. At the northern end of the valley, on a low rise that let it see everything, sat a house. Not a cabin, Not a farmhouse. A house 2 stories of stone and timber, solid and well proportioned with windows that caught the light. Outbuildings clustered around it in an arrangement that spoke of planning rather than accident. Fences ran in straight lines across the pastures, which was rarer than people thought, and meant something about whoever had built them. Vera looked at all of it for the full minute the train took to pull into the station. Then she picked up her traveling bag and stood. The woman waiting on the platform was not who she expected. She was small and round, 60 or close to it, with gray hair pinned severely, and sharp eyes that moved quickly and registered everything. She was dressed practically but neatly. Her hands, Vera noticed, were the hands of someone who worked, not a housekeeper, who supervised, but one who did. There was flour on the left cuff that hadn't quite brushed out. Miss Holloway. It was not a question. The woman had identified her from a distance, which meant she'd had some picture in her head to match to. That's right. Ida Marsh. I managed the house at Whitmore Ranch. A brief pause, something flickering behind the sharp eyes. Mr. Whitmore sends his apologies. He had a matter that couldn't wait this morning. Vera said nothing to this. She watched Ida's face while Ida watched hers, and they arrived at a mutual understanding that neither of them was easily fooled, which was perhaps the most honest thing that could have happened in the first 30 seconds of an acquaintance. The wagon ride took 40 minutes. Ida talked for most of it, which Vera gathered was her natural state. A steady flow of information about the valley, the ranch, the people who worked there, the winter they'd just come through. Vera listened without appearing to, which was a skill she had developed early and relied on heavily. She was building a picture, cross-referencing details, noting what Ida chose to include and what she didn't. 5,800 acres. 64 head of cattle and rising, 12 full-time hands plus seasonal workers during the cutting months. Timber rights on the eastern slope that brought in half the ranch's annual income. This was not a struggling operation. This was something that had been built with intention over a long period of time, by someone who knew what they were doing and didn't stop when it got difficult. "What's Mr. Whitmore like?" Vera asked when Ida paused to navigate a rough patch of road. The pause that followed was exactly 1 second too long. "He's fair," Ida said. The same word as the letter. Not a coincidence, Vera suspected. Either Cade Whitmore had asked Ida to use that word specifically, or it was simply the word that everyone who knew him reached for when pressed. Either way, it was notable. "Fair how?" Vera said. Ida glanced at her. "Recalibrating, maybe. He doesn't ask anything of his people that he won't do himself. Doesn't say one thing and do another. Pays on time every time. Man's word is his bond. I've seen him honor a handshake deal 10 years after the other party forgot they'd made it." She guided the horses around a rut. "Some people call that rigid. I call it reliable." Vera thought about this. What do people who don't like him say about him? This time Ida smiled, small and somewhat approving. That he's hard to read. That he doesn't explain himself enough. That he doesn't care what people think of him, which some folks take as arrogance. She shrugged one shoulder. "I've known the man 14 years. That's not arrogance. That's just someone who decided early that reputation was less useful than character. The ranch came into view as they crested the last rise before the northern valley floor, and Vera saw it properly for the first time. Closer, larger, more fully itself than it had appeared from the train. Workers moved between the buildings in that particular way, of people who know exactly what they're doing and why. A dog, old and unhurried, lay in a patch of sun near the main barn door. Smoke rose from the house chimney. Cade Whitmore was standing on the porch. He was not reading the contract anymore. He was simply standing, watching them come. He was taller than she had somehow expected, with the particular build of a man who had done hard physical work for a long time, and whose body had organized itself accordingly. Dark hair going gray at the temples and through the close-cut beard. Lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting at distances. He wore a canvas work shirt and plain trousers and boots that had been resoled at least twice. His hands, she noticed even from a distance, were not the hands of someone who merely owned land. He watched the wagon come in with an expression that Vera, who was good at reading faces, could not immediately name. It was not the expression of a man waiting for something he had arranged. It was more careful than that, more internal. When his eyes moved from Ida to her, and she saw the moment they did, saw something in his face change in a way that was gone. Before she could pin it down, the thought arrived in her mind without invitation. He knows who I am, not in the ordinary sense of knowing a stranger's name. Something else, something that had already happened before today. She didn't know where the thought came from. She filed it and kept it. He came down the porch steps as the wagon stopped, not rushing. The dog lifted its head, decided the situation didn't require action, and put its head back down. Miss Holloway. Mr. Whitmore. His handshake was brief and direct. His grip matched hers, not the careful grip some men used with women. The performative gentleness that was really just condescension with better manners, but an actual handshake. Calluses where calluses belonged. A hand that knew what work felt like. He looked at Ida then. Just a look, steady 3 seconds, the whole of it. Ida looked back without flinching, but she also looked, Vera noted, like someone who knew they had something to answer for. "Leave her trunk," he said to Ida, not unkindly. "Owen will get it. Come inside, Miss Holloway." The house interior was nothing like the outside of a wealthy man's home usually predicted. No elaborate furnishings, no portraits, no effort to display wealth. What was there instead were bookshelves, actual ones built into the walls full of actual books, many of them clearly read multiple times. A large fireplace of local stone. A table in the main room that was functional and solid, and had probably served as a work surface as often as a dining one. Through the window at the back, the valley spread out in full, the river catching light 2 miles off. He showed her into the study and closed the door. "Sit down," he said. Not an order, an invitation, but the kind that didn't carry much doubt about whether it would be accepted. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then apparently decided that standing was wrong for what he needed to say. and sat across from her. "I'd have placed that advertisement without asking me," he said. "I was not looking for anyone. I want to be clear about that before anything else, because you traveled a long distance based on information that was provided without my knowledge, and you have a right to know it." Vera looked at him. He held her gaze without any of the discomfort that honesty sometimes costs people. "What happened when you found out?" she asked. "I considered sending a letter telling you not to come." He said it evenly. "I didn't." "Why not?" Something moved briefly across his expression. Here and gone. "A number of reasons. Some of them I'd rather explain in person than in a letter." He set his hands flat on his thighs. "What I can tell you now is this: whatever you were told, whatever you were led to expect, I'm not holding you to any of it. You can stay for a month and see if this is somewhere you want to be. At the end of that month, if you want to go, I'll see you to the train and pay your way to wherever you're headed. No debt, no obligation, no hard feelings." He reached into the desk drawer and placed a sealed envelope on the table between them. "That's passage money," he said, "in case you want to leave sooner than a month." Vera looked at the envelope. She did not pick it up. "You built all of this," she said, "from nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "More or less. You don't strike me as a man who does things without reasons." "I don't." "So what's your reason for letting me stay?" The question sat between them. He looked at her with the same steady quality she was beginning to understand was simply how he paid attention fully, without performance, without the social adjustments most people made to seem more comfortable or more agreeable than they actually were. "I'd rather tell you that when I know you better," he said, "if that's agreeable." It was not the answer she expected. It was also, she recognized, not a deflection. There was a difference between a man who was hiding something and a man who was waiting for the right time. She wasn't sure yet which this was. "Fair enough," she said, and put just enough dryness into it that he would know she'd noticed the echo of his own word. His mouth moved. Barely. But it moved. The room she was given was on the second floor, east-facing, larger than any room she had slept in since she was a small child. A bed with a real frame, a wardrobe, a writing desk set at the window. The window looked out over the valley, and in the last light of the afternoon, with the mountains going dark against a pale sky, it was the kind of view that a person could develop a complicated relationship with. Beautiful in a way that asked something of you that required you to be equal to it. Vera unpacked her trunk methodically and did not let herself think too hard about where she was or what she'd agreed to. There would be time for all of that later. The first week was mostly observation. Vera had always learned that way, by watching before acting, by letting a situation reveal itself, before deciding how to respond to it. Some people read this as passivity. It wasn't. It was the discipline of someone who had made enough costly mistakes in youth to understand the value of patience. What she observed, the ranch ran on a rhythm that had been established over many years and had achieved a kind of organizational elegance that only came from constant refinement. The men knew their work and did it without being told repeatedly. which meant either the work was well designed or the people had been well chosen, and probably both. Owen Marsh, the foreman, a man of 60 with a bad knee and a quiet authority that had nothing to do with his voice, moved through the place like someone reading a language he'd been fluent in for decades. Cade himself was rarely in the house during the day. He was somewhere on the property doing what he knew. She saw him coming in at dusk most evenings, saddle worn, pulling his gloves off. And she noticed that the men who worked for him greeted him differently than they greeted Owen with. Owen, it was the easy comfort of long familiarity. With Cade, it was something more careful, more considered, the way people behave around someone whose opinion of them matters. He was not unkind. He was not warm. He occupied a middle ground that Vera did not quite have a name for yet. At dinner, the two of them at a table that could have seated 8. They talked about practical things. The ranch, the coming season, her impression of Silver Fork Valley. He asked questions that were genuine, not social. She answered the same way. Ida served and occasionally inserted herself into the conversation with the confidence of someone who had decided years ago that her observations were welcome, whether invited or not, which Cade bore with the patience of long practice. "You're quieter than I expected," he said on the 4th evening. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. "I don't know. Something louder. I save loud for when it's necessary." He considered this, nodded once as if she'd said something that matched a theory he'd been developing. She found this mildly interesting and somewhat irritating in equal measure. On the 8th day, she found the problem with the feed supplier. It was not something she was looking for. Owen had left a folder of receipts on the kitchen table, the kind of administrative spillover that happened in any working operation. Papers migrating from office to common space and back. And Vera, waiting for the coffee to come to heat, had done what she always did with documents left in her proximity. She read them. By the time the coffee was ready, she had gone through the folder twice. She poured 2 cups, put them on a tray, and carried them to the study where Owen was going through his own paperwork. "You're paying 18% above market rate for supplemental feed," she said, setting his cup where he could reach it. "From Greer's outfit over the pass." Owen looked up. He had the expression of a man deciding something. "That a question or a statement?" "Statement. The question is why." "Greer's reliable. Delivers on schedule, qualities consistent. You're not in a cash crisis. You have storage capacity for 2 months of supplemental. If Greer's late, once you're not in trouble." She sat down across from him, not as a guest, but as someone who had decided she had a right to be there. "There are 3 suppliers in Billings and 1 in Lewistown who come in lower. I can have prices by Wednesday." Owen was quiet for a long moment. He had the look Vera had noticed of a man who was not opposed to being corrected, only to being corrected incorrectly, which was an important distinction. "I'll mention it to Cade," he said finally. "Or I will." His mouth twitched. She understood in that moment that Owen Marsh had made up his mind about her, and the decision was not unfavorable. That evening before dinner, there was a knock at the door of her room. Cade stood in the hallway with the feed receipts folder under his arm. "Owen says you have something." She showed him what she'd found. He sat at the edge of the desk and listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he looked at the numbers she'd written out. Comparative organized, the kind of summary that took work to produce and saved time to receive. "Henderson's outfit in Billings," he said. "He's new. 2 years in business, no complaints I could find. He won't have Greer's track record, but we're not betting the operation on one vendor, we're diversifying." She looked at him. "Split the orders. 80% Greer, 20% Henderson for the first season. If Henderson delivers, reverse those numbers next year. Worst case, you're out one small order and you have information." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the numbers, not at her. "All right," he said. That was the beginning of something, though neither of them named it at the time. The second week was different from the first. The observation period ended not because she decided it was over, but because the work required her to be in it, rather than beside it. She started riding the property with Owen in the mornings, learning the pastures and the water sources and the invisible geography that determined how the cattle moved through the land. She sat in on the supply meetings that happened on Wednesday afternoons. She read the timber contracts that were filed in the study cabinet, not because anyone asked her to, but because understanding the operation required understanding all of it. Nobody told her to do any of this. Nobody told her not to. On Thursday of the second week, she was in the south pasture when one of the hands, a man named Doyle, who had been with the ranch for 7 years and carried that tenure like a credential, made a comment within her earshot about the new arrangement up at the house. The words were not directed at her. The volume was. She kept riding. She had learned a long time ago that there were two kinds of tests. The kind where responding directly was the right move, and the kind where the right move was to do nothing except continue to be exactly what you were until the test became irrelevant. Doyle was the second kind. She had no doubt about this. 3 days later, she was helping to shift a water trough that had cracked and needed to be replaced. Unglamorous work that involved mud and leverage and considerable physical effort. And Doyle was on the same crew. They worked without talking, which was fine. At the end of it, when they were packing up, he said, without looking at her directly, "You've got a good eye for grade." It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that mattered more than large ones. "Thank you," she said. They left it there. It was in the third week that she found Rook. He was in the fourth stall from the end of the main barn, a brown quarter horse, 15 hands, with an expression that Vera recognized as belonging to animals who had developed opinions and were prepared to stand by them. The stall door was latched but not locked, which suggested he wasn't considered dangerous but was considered opinionated, which was its own category. She had been assigned a gray mare named Sally for her daily rides, reliable, smooth-gaited. About as much personality as a well-made piece of furniture. Sally was fine. Rook interested her. She let herself into the stall the first afternoon and stood at the back of it doing nothing, just present. Rook watched her from the far corner with the evaluating stillness of a horse that had been approached wrong enough times to have developed a strong position on the subject. She came back the next day and stood in the same spot. On the third day, Rook came to her. He put his nose against her shoulder and held it there for a moment, and Vera stood still and let him decide what he wanted to decide about her. It was a good negotiation. Both parties came out of it satisfied. She was working with him on a simple exercise the following afternoon, getting him comfortable with her at his near side, when she heard boots on the barn floor and looked up to find Cade standing in the stall doorway, one shoulder against the post watching. "You're approaching him from the wrong side, he said. "He doesn't like it." "I know." She kept her attention on Rook, who had noticed Cade but was for once not retreating. "I'm working up to the right one." He watched for a moment. Most people just fight him from the wrong side until he gives up. That teaches him the wrong thing. Cade was quiet. Then he stepped into the stall which Rook tolerated with only a small pin of his ears and came to stand beside the horse, settling his hand on the crest of Rook's neck in a way that the horse leaned into without thinking about it. "He came from an outfit over near Havre," Cade said. "Second owner, I think. Came in with some defensive habits already built." He ran his thumb along the base of Rook's mane. "Owen wanted to sell him on. I didn't." "Why not?" "Because the habits were the owner's fault, not the horse's." He looked at Rook rather than at Vera. Seemed wrong to penalize an animal for how he'd been handled. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses, and the particular oiled wood smell of tack that had been properly maintained for years. Outside, the afternoon light was going long the way it did in April, when spring was still making up its mind, pale gold coming in low through the open barn doors and catching the dust in the air, making something of ordinary particles. Vera tried approaching from Rook's offside. The horse stood steady. "There it is," Cade said. He left a few minutes later without ceremony back to whatever work waited for him. She stayed with Rook until the light changed. It occurred to her, riding back to the house in the blue dusk, that she had been in Silver Fork Valley for 3 weeks and had not once thought about the passage money sitting in that envelope on her writing desk. She thought about it now briefly, and then thought about other things. That night she wrote a letter to her mother. She tried to say something accurate and found it harder than expected, because accuracy required her to admit things she hadn't fully processed yet. That the ranch was larger than she'd imagined. That the work was real and she was good at it. That the man who lived here was not at all what she'd expected. And that she was not sure what she expected to have expected. But it wasn't this. She wrote instead about the valley, about Rook, about Ida's cooking and Owen's dry humor, and the way the mountains looked in the morning when the overnight cold had sharpened the air to a clarity that made even ordinary things look like they'd been freshly made. She read it back and felt it was insufficient, and sent it anyway because something insufficient and honest was better than something complete and false. She did not write about the feeling she couldn't name, the one that had started in that first conversation in Cade Whitmore's study and hadn't quite left. The feeling that this man knew something about her that she didn't know about herself, or knew something about her past that she hadn't thought to wonder about, or was carrying a fact in his chest that he had decided for reasons of his own not to give to her yet. She was a patient person, She had been patient all her life, but patience had never felt quite like this. Not like waiting for something to come to her, but like standing at a door she couldn't open yet, listening to something on the other side of it that she couldn't quite make out. The month wasn't up. She would wait. After Vera had retired that night, when the house had gone still and the lamps were out in every room but one, Cade Whitmore sat alone in his study. The fire had burned down to coals. On the desk in front of him was a folded letter, not a new one. The paper had been unfolded and refolded many times. The creases were soft and deep, the kind that came from years of handling. He read it the way he always read it, slowly, as though the words might have changed since the last time, though they never did. Whitmore, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you already know it. I never found the right words to say what I needed to say in person, so I'm writing them down and trusting they'll find you. I know you've been trying to help. I know what you've been putting into that account, and I know there's no talking you out of it, so I won't try. But I need you to hear this. My daughter is not a debt to be paid. She's not the settlement of anything between you and me. You saved yourself a dozen times over. What happened in that barn was just two men in the same dark place at the same moment. I'd have done it for anybody. Vera is hard-headed and proud, and she would starve before she accepted charity from someone she thought looked down on her. Whatever you do, however you do it, don't let her think she got somewhere because someone felt sorry for her. She didn't. She got somewhere because she's the most capable person I raised, and I didn't raise her well enough to know it. You're a fair man. I've believed that since the night I met you. Be fair to her. Martin Holloway. Cade set the letter down on the desk. He had known her name before the advertisement, when Ida had brought him the envelope, sheepish, defiant, already prepared to be scolded. And he'd seen the name on the response. He had sat with it for 3 days before sending the reply. He told himself it was not a calculated decision. He told himself it was the right thing for reasons he could articulate. He told himself Martin Holloway had asked for fairness, and fairness meant giving her a real chance at a real life, not the kind arranged around an obligation he'd carried for 12 years, and she didn't know existed. He was honest enough, sitting alone in the firelight at the end of a long day, to acknowledge that none of these things fully explained why he had written back. He locked the letter in the desk drawer. Outside, a night wind moved through the pines on the northern slope. In the house above him, Vera Holloway was asleep in the east-facing room, 26 years old, and 3 weeks into a life she hadn't entirely chosen, already reading ledgers and learning horses, and making herself quietly, without announcement, indispensable. She looked like her father he had thought the first day, not in feature so much as in bearing, that uprightness, that economy of motion, that quality of occupying exactly the space required and not 1 inch more. He put out the lamp. Fair Martin had said he would try. The last day of the trial month arrived and passed without ceremony. Cade didn't ask. Vera didn't say. The envelope with the passage money was still in the desk drawer of her room, untouched. And on the morning of the 31st day, she came downstairs at the usual hour and sat down at the table and placed 2 sheets of paper in front of his coffee cup. He looked at the papers, looked at her. "You're staying. I'm staying." He picked up the first sheet, read it in the methodical way he read everything, without rushing, without performing interest, just actually reading. The proposal covered the stable rotation schedule which horses worked, which days, how recovery time was being distributed, why the current arrangement was producing fatigue in 3 animals that didn't show until you looked at the stride data over 4 weeks instead of 1. "The third section is more practical than the first," he said. "I know. The first section is there so you have something to push back on without having to push back on what I actually want." A silence. "That's a dishonest tactic," he said. "It's an effective one." He set the paper down. Something moved in his face, briefly, unmistakably, the kind of genuine amusement that a person couldn't produce on demand. It was there for 1 full second before his expression settled back to its customary baseline. And in that second, Vera registered it with the precision of someone who had learned to track small things because large things were often preceded by them. "All right," he said. He picked up his coffee. "Leave the second sheet with Owen." She did not let herself smile until she was outside. The months that followed were the first months of Vera's adult life that felt in some fundamental way proportionate. Not easy. The work was real work, physical, in ways she was accustomed to, and demanding in ways she wasn't, requiring her to learn quickly in areas where she had no prior ground. But there was a ratio in it that she recognized from somewhere deep. A sense that what she put in was connected in honest terms to what came back, which was not an experience she had associated with adulthood until now. She developed a routine, and the routine developed her. Early mornings with the horses, which she had claimed as her hour without asking anyone's permission. Mid-mornings in the office, going through the operational ledgers that Owen had kept conscientiously, but hadn't had time to analyze. Afternoons out on the property writing the sections she hadn't covered yet, mapping the land in the particular way that could only be done by moving through it repeatedly until it became internal. Not just coordinates on paper, but the actual feel of the terrain where the drainage ran, where the grass got thin in dry spells, where the cattle drifted when the wind came from the north. She found the second problem in May. It was smaller than the feed supplier issue, a discrepancy in the equipment maintenance records, a pattern in the billing from the farrier that didn't match the shoeing schedule she could verify against the horses themselves. Someone was invoicing for work not completed. Not a large sum, but consistent across 6 months, which meant it was deliberate. She brought it to Cade on a Thursday evening, set the relevant receipts on his desk in order, showed him what she'd found, explained the comparison. He looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. "That's Greer's son-in-law," he said finally. "I know. You checked. Before I came to you, I didn't want to make an accusation without being certain." He sat back. "What do you think should happen?" The question surprised her, not because it was unreasonable, but because she hadn't expected him to ask her, rather than simply act. She thought about it honestly. He goes, she said. The amount isn't the point. The pattern is. A man who steals small when he will steal large when he gets the chance. Cade nodded. Not agreeing with her conclusion specifically, she understood that, but with the reasoning that led there. I'll talk to him tomorrow. He did. It was a short conversation. She could see it happening from the window of the office where she was working, though she couldn't hear the words. The man rode out that afternoon. Cade came back in and said nothing about it, which she appreciated. Later over dinner, he said without preamble, "You were right to come to me with that instead of handling it yourself." She looked up. "Not because you couldn't have handled it," he said, "but because it was my call to make. Knowing the difference between what you're right to act on and what belongs to someone else to act on, that's harder than most things." She thought about this for the rest of the evening. He was right. And what struck her was that he'd said it not as a rebuke. She hadn't handled it herself. So there was no rebuke to make, but as an acknowledgement of a distinction she'd navigated correctly, stated plainly. Because he thought she should know. She'd done it right. It was the kind of feedback she had never once received from her father. Not because her father was a bad man, but because her father, like most men of his generation and circumstance, had not considered it his job to tell a woman when she'd made a correct decision. Correct decisions were simply the expected minimum. It was only the incorrect ones that warranted comment. She wrote to her mother that week and did not include any of this because some things took longer to know what to do with. Her mother wrote back, as she always did, in practical terms. The garden was coming in the east. Fence had held through the spring storms. Her neighbor had helped her repair the roof section that had lifted. And then at the end, as she always did, "Are you well, Vera? I don't mean healthy. I mean well." Vera sat with that question for a while before writing back that yes, she thought she was. Or she was getting there, which might be the same thing approached from a different direction. She sealed the envelope and set it on the hall table for the post wagon in the morning. Then she stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house. Somewhere in the study she could hear the faint sound of papers being moved, a drawer opening and closing. The ordinary sounds of a working life continuing past dark. She had grown up in a house where the evenings were either loud with tension or quiet with the particular exhaustion of people who had nothing left after the day's work. This was neither. This was something she did not quite have a word for yet, but that she was beginning carefully and without announcement to trust. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. There was a thought she'd been carrying at the back of her mind for several weeks. Not a worry exactly, but a question without a shape yet. She knew the ranch better now than she'd known her father's land after years of working it. She knew where every dollar came from and where most of it went. She knew the things that worked and the things that needed attention. And in the knowing, a new question had started forming: had any of this been prepared for her? Not the work itself. The work was real. She had no doubt about that. But the place, the welcome, the particular ease with which she had been allowed to find her footing. She set the question aside, as she did with things that weren't ready to be answered yet, and went to bed. It was a rainy afternoon in late May. when Ida's kitchen became the setting for an exchange that Vera would think about many times afterward. They were working together on the summer preservation, a task that required more hands than one with jars and lids and the particular focused attention of work that couldn't be left half done once started. Vera had learned early that Ida's way of doing this was different from her mother's, and better in several specific respects, which she had adopted without comment. Ida, she had discovered, respected adaptation more than deference. What she didn't respect was indifference. They'd been working for 2 hours in comfortable near silence when Ida said without particular preamble, "You're not what I expected when I placed that advertisement." Vera kept her hands moving. "What did you expect?" Someone more. Ida seemed to consider the word carefully. "Accommodating." Accommodating how? Willing to be shaped. A younger woman, maybe. Someone who'd come in and let the place form her. Ida set a sealed jar aside. "I thought that's what Cade needed. Someone the house could absorb." Vera looked up then. "What did you actually get?" "Someone who was already formed." Ida didn't say it as a complaint. Someone who was going to shape the house rather than be shaped by it. And Ida was quiet for a moment, her hands still busy. "And I was wrong about what he needed." She set another jar down with a small, definitive click. "He doesn't need someone to absorb. He needs someone to answer back." Vera looked at her. "You're not sorry you placed the advertisement." "I'm sorry I did it without asking him. I'm not sorry about the outcome." Ida picked up the next jar. There's a difference. Vera had come to understand over these months that Ida Marsh was a woman of considerable intelligence who had spent her life operating in roles that didn't always reward intelligence, and who had made peace with this by finding her own channels of influence and using them without apology. It was not entirely unlike what Vera herself did. They would never be friends in the easy way of women who had grown up together or who shared similar temperaments. But there was a mutual recognition between them that was in its own way sufficient. It was in this period in late June that Cade made the mistake. She learned about it not from him, but from Owen, who came to find her in the north pasture on a Thursday afternoon, with an expression that she had not seen on his face before, the expression of a man who was working out whether to say something and had decided reluctantly that he should. The timber contract. Cade had signed a 3-year agreement with a logging outfit over the pass. A good price, reliable volume terms that looked strong on paper. What he had not fully verified was the question of who actually controlled the outfit's operating capital. Owen had been trying to check this for 2 weeks and had just confirmed it. The outfit was partially financed through Stroud's bank, which meant that when Stroud decided to pressure the arrangement, and he would, that was simply a matter of when Cade would find himself locked into a contract that could be disrupted at the worst possible time. "He doesn't know yet," Vera said. "He knows something's wrong. He asked me to look into it, and I just finished looking." Owen turned his hat in his hands. "Thought you might want to come when I tell him." "Why?" "Because you're going to see something you haven't seen before." Owen glanced at her. "And because I think you being there will make it easier for him to hear it straight." She didn't fully understand this at the time. She understood it later. They found Cade in the study going over the same contract, which suggested some part of him had already arrived at the suspicion. He looked up when they came in, looked at Owen's face, set the contract down. Owen told him, flat and complete, no softening. Cade listened without interrupting, which was what he always did. But she could see this listening was different from his usual kind. There was something controlled in it, a deliberate steadiness that spoke of effort. When Owen finished, Cade was quiet for a full minute. "That was careless," he said, not to Owen, to himself. Flat and precise, the way a man speaks when he's holding himself to account with no intermediary. "I moved on the price without finishing the verification. That was careless, and it was mine." Owen said nothing. He had the look of a man who had seen this before, the particular way this particular person absorbed his own errors, which was without evasion and without theater. "What are the options?" Vera said. Both men looked at her. She kept her voice level. "We know now. We have time to work with it." "What are the options?" Cade looked at the contract, then at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not gratitude exactly, but a recognition. She was not going to sit in this room and let him be hard on himself past the point of productive. She was going to ask the next question. He seemed to have registered this as a fact about her, and to have found it on some level steadying. "3," he said. He leaned forward and they worked through the evening. They found a path. It wasn't without cost. They'd need to renegotiate terms and accept a worse price on volume for the first season. And it would require a conversation with the logging outfit that Cade was not going to enjoy. But it was a path. When Owen left and it was just the two of them, Cade closed the contract folder and sat back. "I should have caught that," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. She held his gaze without flinching from the agreement in it, which she suspected most people around him did not do. "I'll be more careful going forward." "I know you will." She stood. "Get some sleep. It looks better in the morning." "Does it?" "Most things do." She paused at the door. "Not all things, but most." She heard as she started up the stairs what might have been a low sound of amusement, or might have been something else entirely. She kept walking. Aldrich Stroud came to Whitmore Ranch on a Tuesday morning in early July. He arrived in a buggy rather than on horseback, which said something about how he thought of himself in relation to the places he visited. The buggy was well made and recently painted. His clothes were the clothes of a man who wanted to be seen as both prosperous and restrained. A combination that required money to pull off and that Stroud had clearly practiced. Cade was in the east pasture. Vera was on the porch going through the week's purchase orders when the buggy came through the gate. Stroud was 55 and had the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled into a harder version of itself. The bones still good, the eyes still sharp, but something in the overall composition that had gone calculating where it had probably once been, merely confident. He stepped down from the buggy and looked at her the way a man looks when he's already decided what he's looking at. "Miss Holloway," he said, "or congratulations seem to be in order." "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "You're Aldrich Stroud." Something flickered in his eyes at the fact that she'd named him before he'd introduced himself. He recovered smoothly. "My reputation precedes me. I hope favorably." "Mixed," she said. "Can I help you?" He was not accustomed to being received this way at front porches, she could see that. He adjusted. "I heard there was someone new at Whitmore Ranch, and I make it a point to welcome new neighbors to the valley. It seemed only neighborly to introduce myself." "That's kind. Mr. Whitmore is out on the property. I can pass along your hello. I'd be happy to wait. He'll be a while." A pause. Stroud looked at the purchase orders in her hand. At the porch, at the house, cataloging. "And you're settling in well. Coming from Nebraska, quite a change." "It is." "Your family's land back in Nebraska, your father's place. Holloway, was it?" He said the name like he was just placing it just now, remembering. "Difficult circumstances after he passed. The debts, I mean. I have contacts in the banking world there. It came across my desk some years ago." He looked at her with something he intended to read as sympathy. "Terrible thing to work land your whole life and leave your family in that position." Vera looked at him steadily. "My father worked as hard as any man I've known." Of course he did." Stroud settled back slightly. "I only meant it's fortunate things resolved as they did. For your family's sake." He left that there in the air between them like smoke from a fire he'd just set. Then he smiled, tipped his hat. "Give my regards to your husband. Tell him I'd welcome the chance to talk business one of these days." She watched his buggy go back through the gate and sat with what had just happened organizing it. He knew about the debts. He knew they'd been resolved. He was implying without saying outright that he knew how. That last part was the important one. That last part was not a detail he had come across accidentally in some banking correspondence. That was information he had gone looking for. She told Kate about it at dinner. Told it straight, the whole conversation, nothing edited. He listened without moving. "He's had eyes on the ranch for 10 years, he said when she finished. "Every time I've been through a difficult season, he's appeared. Offering to buy, offering to lend, offering to be useful. In ways that come with strings." He looked at his hands. "When I don't take the offer, he finds other angles. That's how he works." What did he mean about the debts being resolved? A pause. One beat too long. "There are things about your family's history, and my own, that I've been meaning to tell you." He met her eyes. "Not tonight, but soon. I owe you that conversation, and I intend to have it." She watched his face. He was not deflecting. She had seen him deflect. And this wasn't the movement of a man avoiding. It was the movement of a man choosing his moment carefully, for a reason she didn't yet have the information to evaluate. "All right," she said. "Soon." "Soon," he said. She accepted this. She wasn't sure why exactly, except that in 4 months, she had not once caught him in an evasion. And the credit of that accumulated. Fletcher arrived on a Wednesday in late July. She saw him before he saw her, a tall figure on a bay horse coming through the main gate at a trot, the particular set of his shoulders unmistakable even from 200 yards. Fletcher had her father's height and none of his stillness. He moved like someone who had spent years covering ground and had developed the habit of riding as if there was somewhere to be. She was not glad to see him exactly. She was not glad. Fletcher was the most complicated person in her life, which was a distinction earned over a long time and a great deal of accumulated evidence. She started toward the gate, and then she saw Cade. He had come out of the barn 20 feet to her left, close enough that she would have heard him if she'd been paying attention, and he had stopped. He was looking at Fletcher, not with the neutral alertness he brought to most new arrivals, with something else. Fletcher pulled up at the gate and got down. He looked at Cade. The two men stood 30 feet apart and did not speak for 3 full seconds. It was not the silence of strangers assessing each other. It was a different kind of silence, the kind between people who already have a fact about each other that they haven't said aloud yet. Fletcher crossed the distance, held out his hand. Whitmore. Holloway. Cade shook it. His face had settled back to its default. She's in the house. Vera reached them then. Fletcher turned to her with the smile she had spent her entire life knowing, the one that meant he was glad to see her and also was bracing for whatever came next, which in their experience had often involved her being angry at him for something specific and justified. Vera. He pulled her into a brief, firm hug that she returned with the particular restraint of someone who has not yet decided how much warmth the situation has earned. "Why are you here, Fletcher?" "Came to see you." He glanced between her and Cade. "And to see how things were." She heard the second part of that sentence differently than the first. She looked at Cade, whose expression gave her nothing, and then back at her brother, whose gave her slightly more. Later, when Cade had gone back to his work and Fletcher had put up his horse and they were sitting at the kitchen table, with Ida conspicuously finding things to do in the next room. Conspicuously enough that she was clearly listening. Fletcher told her. Not everything. She understood later that it wasn't everything, but enough. Their father had told him in the last months about a man named Cade Whitmore, about a night 12 years ago at a ranch over the pass, a barn fire that moved faster than anyone expected, a stranger who'd been trapped, and a man who'd gone in without calculating the cost. Fletcher knew about the money that had moved quietly into their family's bank account. He'd figured it out the year before their father died, when he'd been going through the books trying to understand the state of the finances. He'd confronted his father. Their father had told him the shape of it without all the details and had asked him to keep it to himself. He said he didn't want you to feel like you owed someone you'd never met, Fletcher said. Said you'd spend your whole life trying to pay back a debt you never agreed to carry. Vera looked at the table, then at her brother. You knew who Cade Whitmore was when you answered that advertisement. Fletcher looked away and back. I knew the name. I knew some of what he'd done. He paused. I wanted to see who he'd become. Without asking me. Vera, you made a decision about my life without asking me. Again. Her voice was even. Not cold, something more controlled than cold. You seem to have a habit of that. I know. I'm not asking you to explain it. I'm telling you, I know you did it. He accepted this without the defensive response she half expected. Fletcher, whatever his faults, had always been able to hear the truth when it was delivered plainly. It was one of the better things about him. "You're not angry," he said. "It was an observation, not a question." "I'm something," she said. "I'm still working out what." He stayed 4 days. They talked the kind of talking that they only did when they were alone together. The kind that didn't require either of them to perform anything. He watched Cade with the careful attention of someone doing a final accounting, and she watched him watching, and neither of them said anything about what either of them was seeing. When he left, he shook her hand, which was an unusual thing for him to do, instead of embracing her. And she understood it as a formality of acknowledgement, a gesture toward an equality between them that they were both slowly and imperfectly arriving at. "He's a good man," Fletcher said, meaning Cade. "I know," Vera said. She rode back from the gate and didn't let herself think for the rest of the morning about how certain she'd been when she said it. Vera found the old shed by accident. She had been taking a different path back from the eastern pasture, following a fence line she hadn't traced yet, and the structure appeared at the edge of the tree line without any particular announcement. A low building older than everything else on the ranch, built from rough-cut timber that had gone the gray of weathered wood. Not a ruin, but close to the edge of one. The roof was sound. The door had a new hinge on the right side where the original had given out, which meant someone was still tending to it. She got down and tied Rook to the fence post. The door was unlocked. Inside, a low ceiling, a packed earth floor, afternoon light coming through 2 small windows that were thick with dust, but intact. A wood stove that looked like it had been used recently. A chair. A plain wooden chair, low-backed, set at an angle that suggested someone had put it there deliberately, rather than just left it. And on the small shelf beside the chair, a book. Not a new one. She stood in the doorway and looked at it, and understood without needing to be told that she was looking at where Cade Whitmore had started. She heard him arrive sometime in the next few minutes. The sound of a horse coming along the fence line, pulling up, the unhurried sound of someone getting down. He appeared in the doorway and looked at her in the chair, with the expression of a man who has been found somewhere private and is deciding in real time how he feels about that. "I followed the fence line," she said. "I'm sorry if this is..." "It's fine." He came in, stood for a moment looking at the space, the way a person looks at something they've looked at so many times that they no longer see it the way a stranger would. Then he brought the other chair. There was a second one stacked in the corner she hadn't noticed, and put it near the first and sat down. She settled back. The old dog, who had apparently followed Cade from the barn without her noticing, came in and chose a spot of floor and went to sleep with the completeness of an animal that has no unresolved business. Neither of them spoke. The light through the dusty windows was the particular gold of late summer afternoon, long and warm, and somehow already elegiac, already carrying in it the memory of itself. Outside, the wind moved through the pines at the tree line in a sound that Vera had been hearing every day for months, and had begun without marking the moment it happened to find comfortable. Cade opened his book. Not as a dismissal, she understood after these months the difference between his silences. He read. She looked at the valley through the open door, the long fall of the land from the tree line down to the river, the far mountains going blue in the afternoon haze. She was not trying to do anything or prove anything. She was just there. That was when she understood something she hadn't been able to name before. There had been a part of herself operating just beneath the surface of every day since she'd arrived. That was always measuring, always tracking whether she was contributing enough, whether her presence here made sense, whether she was building something real or occupying a position someone had cleared for her. It was an old reflex, worn into her from years of being in a place where her worth was always conditional. Sitting in the old shed, doing nothing, saying nothing, she noticed that the reflex was quiet. She hadn't done anything to make it quiet. She hadn't proved anything or earned anything in the last hour. She was just in a room with a man who was reading a book, and neither of them needed to be anywhere else, and that was sufficient. The dog made a sound in its sleep. Cade turned a page. The light shifted a degree. When she finally stood to go, she said only, "I'll leave the door the way I found it. Come back whenever you want," he said. He didn't look up from the book. "It's just a place." She thought, walking back to where Rook was tied, that it wasn't just a place. But she also thought that he knew that already and that his saying otherwise was its own kind of honesty. The Saturday market in Silver Fork Town happened once a month through the summer and brought in everyone within 20 miles. Ida had needed ribbon and a particular kind of canning wax that the general store in town stocked, and the supply wagon didn't carry. And Vera had ridden in with her on a clear August morning that smelled of dry grass and distance. The market occupied the main street from the bank to the feed store wagons pulled up on both sides. Goods laid out on boards, the general noise of commerce and conversation, and people who only saw each other once a month, catching up on what had happened in between. Vera moved through it with Ida collecting what they'd come for, noticing faces cataloging the social landscape the way she'd been cataloging everything else. She saw Stroud from 30 feet away. He was standing near the hardware store in a group of 4 men, small landowners, she thought, from the posture of men who were being talked to by someone with more leverage than they had. He was talking. The men were listening in the way people listen when they're not sure they can afford not to. She and Ida went around the far side of a wagon. Vera kept her attention on what she was doing. She heard her name from 10 feet away. Not her name exactly, her family name. The Holloway debts. Most of it paid off in the last few years. Stroud's voice carrying clearly on the morning air. Conversational. Informational. Bank records are public business. Man's entitled to spend his money how he likes. She stopped. Whitmore always did know how to make an investment pay. A pause, the deliberate kind. Some men buy cattle. Some buy timber rights. His voice dropped in the particular way of a man who wants to be sure he's heard, while appearing to speak quietly. Some men find other ways to secure what they want. She was standing in the open, the wagon between her and him no longer. The group of men had expanded, or she had drifted into earshot, or both. Several faces were turned her direction. Stroud looked at her. His eyes said that he had known exactly where she was. Mrs. Whitmore. Warmth in his voice like veneer on bad wood. I was just speaking about your family. Your father was a well-regarded man in Nebraska, from what I understand. The square was very quiet, or it seemed to be. There was something happening in Vera's chest that was not quite emotion and not quite calculation. A kind of crystallizing the way water goes from liquid to something harder. She could hear her own breathing. She could see in the faces of the men around Stroud the various combinations of discomfort and curiosity and the particular eagerness of people who are watching something they know is wrong but haven't decided to intervene in yet. She looked at Stroud for a long moment. Let the silence sit. Then she said, "Yes, he was." Nothing else. She turned and walked back to Ida, who was standing 6 feet away with the look of a woman who has swallowed several things she is not going to say in this particular public place. They completed their purchases without speaking about it. They rode back without speaking about it. The mountains and the river and the long summer grass went past on both sides of the road, and neither of them said a word. When the ranch gates came into view, Cade was in the yard. He saw them coming from 100 yards and watched the wagon come in with the particular attentiveness of a man whose ability to read circumstances had been developed over a long time and through considerable experience. He looked at Ida's face. He looked at Vera's. He came forward as the wagon stopped. "Vera, not tonight." Her voice was steady. It was the steadiness of someone who was holding something with both hands and knew that the moment she set it down, she would need to understand what it was. "I need tonight. We'll talk tomorrow." She got down from the wagon, walked to the house. She didn't look back. Behind her, she heard nothing, not his voice, not his footsteps following. Just the sound of the yard, the horses, the ordinary noises of the place going about its evening. She didn't look back, but she knew he was still standing there, watching her go the way a man stands when he understands that this particular moment belongs to someone else, and he has no right to take it from her. She went inside, went upstairs to her room and closed the door and stood at the east window looking at the mountains going dark in the last light. The passage money was still in the drawer. She didn't open the drawer. She stood at the window for a long time in the blue dark, with the sound of Silver Fork Valley settling into its nighttime quiet all around her, and she held the weight of what had been said in that square, and under it deeper the weight of what it implied. Tomorrow she would find out the shape of the truth. Tonight she would sit with the parts she already knew, and what they were beginning to mean. She did not sleep. Not because of anger. Anger was a simple emotion, all forward motion, and Vera had always been able to work with simple emotions. This was not anger. This was something that required her to hold very still while she took it apart, the way a person works a rusted lock carefully, without forcing it, attentive to each mechanism. She lay in the dark of her room, the east-facing room where she had arrived in April, not knowing what she was arriving into, and she held what she knew in front of her, one piece at a time. Her father had known Cade Whitmore. Not known him specifically the way one person knows another. After a thing has happened between them that neither will forget, Cade had been paying money into the account that held their family's debts for years, quietly, without any path back to his name. Fletcher had known this or part of it and had said nothing. Stroud had used all of it publicly as a weapon. These were the facts. They were solid, and they did not change in the dark. What she was working with was the question underneath them. Whether the life she had been building here, the months of work, the problems she had found and solved, the respect she had earned from men who didn't give it easily, the sense she had developed of her own competence in this particular place. Whether any of that was real or whether it was an arrangement someone had prepared for her like a stage set, and she had walked into it believing she was standing in the actual world. She had no answer by the time the sky began to gray in the east window. She dressed before full light and went downstairs and outside, not to the kitchen, and not toward the house where Fletcher was sleeping in the guest room, but to the barn. Rook was awake, watching her come in with the alert patience of an animal that has decided this particular person is worth attending to. She let herself into his stall and sat down on the low stool she kept there, her forearms on her knees, and did nothing for a long time except be present. The barn had its own quiet at this hour, the sound of horses breathing, the shift of weight in the stalls, the occasional creak of the building adjusting to the morning cold. Outside, a bird was beginning its first effort at song and abandoning it, not satisfied. She thought about August, thought about the moment last month when she had presented the renegotiated supply chain to Owen and Cade, and watched them both track through it and reach the same conclusion she had at exactly the moment she expected them to. The particular satisfaction of a mind working at the level it was built for, finding its proper use. She thought about the morning she had caught the discrepancy in the farrier's billing, and the steadiness she'd felt bringing it forward, not pride, not showing off, just the clean, solid feeling of a problem identified and a correct action taken. She thought about a dozen other things: a fence line repaired, a sick animal spotted before the condition worsened, a supply order renegotiated, a pattern in the seasonal accounts that had saved them real money when she'd pointed it out. All of it real. All of it done. None of it possible to take back or undo or reframe as something someone else had done for her. Rook put his nose against her shoulder and held it there. She reached up without looking and set her hand against his jaw. Whatever had happened before she arrived, whatever money had moved through, whatever accounts, whatever arrangements had been made between men she hadn't yet met, none of it had done the work for her. None of it had looked at a set of receipts and seen the pattern. None of it had gotten up at 3 a.m. to check on a horse that wasn't eating right. None of it had stood in that market square a week ago and said 2 words instead of nothing or the wrong 10. That was her. It had always been her. She sat with this knowledge until it settled, and then she stood up. She found Fletcher at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, looking like a man who had also not slept. and had decided to stop trying. He looked up when she came in. He had their father's eyes, gray and direct, and in them she saw the same calculation she always saw when Fletcher was deciding how much of a thing to say. "You know," he said. "Not a question. Some of it. Tell me the rest." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a letter. The paper was different from anything she'd seen before. Longer folded, twice the creases worn soft. The handwriting was her father's, but from earlier, before the illness had roughened his hand. Careful, deliberate script, the writing of a man who had not written many letters in his life and intended each one to count. She sat down and read it. Her father had written it to Fletcher specifically because he had known or suspected that Fletcher would be the one to make decisions, given that he was the one who'd been gone long enough to have some distance. He had written it in the spring of the year he died, when he had known for months that he wasn't recovering, and he had asked Fletcher to hold it until the right time, trusting his son to know when that was. The letter laid out the shape of it. The night of the fire 12 years before. Martin Holloway passing a ranch over the pass on his way back from a supply run and seeing the smoke and going in because a man was in there. And that was all there was to that. He'd gotten the man out. The man had been Cade Whitmore. Martin had not known his name until 2 weeks later, when Cade had come to the Holloway farm with enough money in an envelope to cover a year's operating expenses and put it on the kitchen table. Martin had sent him away. Cade had come back a month later with a different kind of offer. Martin had sent him away again. I tried, her father had written. I told him 3 times that I didn't want payment for something any decent man would have done. He listened every time and then did what he was gonna do anyway. By the 2nd year, I understood I couldn't stop him. So I wrote him a letter and told him the one thing I could ask: don't tell my daughter. Don't let her think she owes a debt she never agreed to. Don't let her spend her life paying back something she had no part of incurring. She's the proudest of the 3 of you, and I don't mean that as a fault. I mean it as the thing she needs most, her own ground. Let her find it herself. I don't know if he'll respect that, but I think he will. He's that kind of man. Vera set the letter down on the table between them. The kitchen was bright now, morning coming in through the south window. The ordinary sounds of the ranch starting up outside. Somewhere Owen was giving instructions to someone in the yard. A door closed. A horse moved in its paddock. Mother knew some of it, she said. Fletcher looked at the table. She knew a man had helped with the debts. She didn't know it was connected to the fire. She didn't know his name. He picked up his coffee cup and put it down again. Dad thought the less she knew, the better she'd sleep. He thought that about both of us. He was probably right about her. Vera looked at him. And me. Fletcher met her eyes. For once, he didn't look away first. He was trying to protect you the only way he had left. He was dying, and he couldn't fix the land, and he couldn't fix the debts, and he couldn't be there. The one thing he could still do was try to make sure you didn't walk into something with a weight on you that wasn't yours to carry. She was quiet. He knew you well enough to know you'd pay back every penny even if it broke you, Fletcher said. He was trying to give you a chance to find your feet first. She thought about her father, the particular quality of his silences which had always been dense with things he wouldn't say. The way he had watched her work when she was 16, 17, 18, never once saying directly that she was competent and good at this and that it mattered. She had always believed this was simply how he was unable to offer that kind of acknowledgement, close to it, perhaps incapable. She saw it differently now. A man who had spent his last year of life engineering the conditions under which his daughter could succeed, without knowing the floor he'd placed beneath her. That was not incapacity. That was a man who loved his child in the only architecture he knew how to build, flawed and imperfect, and entirely his own. She stood up, left the letter on the table. Cade was in his study. She had known he would be. He was always in the study in the early morning, the time before the day's work began. She knocked once and pushed the door open. He was at his desk. On the surface in front of him, already out, already unfolded, was Martin Holloway's letter, the one she had seen him lock away the night she arrived. He had taken it out before she came. He had set it where she could see it. He looked up at her with the expression of a man who had expected this, and had been sitting with it, and who had decided before she arrived that he would not make her ask for anything she deserved to be given freely. She set Fletcher's letter down on the desk beside his father's. "My father told you not to let me feel like I owed a debt I never agreed to carry," she said. "Yes. And you thought the best way to do that was to say nothing." For a while, he held her gaze. "I knew Stroud would find out eventually. He finds out everything about everyone in this valley. It's his primary occupation. I told myself I would tell you before he had the chance. I waited too long." "Why?" He looked at the desk and then back at her. "Because every week you were here, you built something that was genuinely yours. And I was afraid that if I told you sooner, you'd look back at all of it and see a stage set instead of what it actually was." He paused. "I was wrong to wait. I let him take from you the right to hear it in a decent way. And that was my failure, not his. He only did what he always does." She sat down. She had not planned to, but she sat down because she was tired in the particular way that came from carrying a heavy question for 24 hours. And she needed to sit with this. "I'm angry," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Not about what you did for my family. You're a man who paid a debt he believed he owed, and I can understand that even if my father didn't want you to. What I'm angry about is that I didn't get to choose whether to know." "I understand. That's not the same as it being all right." "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him. He was doing the thing she had noticed in him from the first weeks, holding himself to account. Without theater, without the evasions that most people used to soften the edges of their own failures. He sat with the weight of this the way she sat with it directly, without flinching from it, not trying to make it lighter than it was. "I need a few days," she said. "Take what you need." She stood. At the door, she stopped. "The work I've done here," she said without turning around. The things I found, the problems I fixed, those are real. It was not a question, but she said it out loud because some things needed to be said out loud even when you already knew the answer. Yes, Cade said, simple and immediate. All of it. She walked out. She went upstairs, changed into her riding clothes, stood at the window for a moment and looked at the valley. The same view she had had since April, altered by nothing except the season and herself. She had thought coming down the stairs that she would feel a specific emotion she could name. What she felt instead was something more like weather. Not a single thing, but a system moving through her in layers. There was grief in it for the version of this place she'd thought she'd been inhabiting, which was simpler and more hers alone. There was something that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it, the feeling of a question finally answering itself. And underneath both of those, quieter and more durable than either, was the thing she had confirmed in the barn that morning. What she had built was real. Nobody could reach in and take that from her. Not Stroud. Not the history she hadn't known. Not even the well-intentioned silence of men who had cared about her in the only ways they knew how. She went to find Owen. He was in the equipment shed going over the harness inventory with the focused attention he brought to all physical maintenance. He looked up when she came in, and she understood from his face that he had known something was coming and had been waiting. I need you to tell me everything you know about what Stroud has done to the small landowners in this valley, she said. Specifically, names, transactions, terms. Not rumors, what you know to be fact. Owen looked at her for a moment. He had the look of a man deciding whether to be cautious and deciding against it. Sit down, he said. This will take a while. It took 2 hours. Owen had 14 years of accumulated observation, and he had been paying attention because he was the kind of man who paid attention to things that mattered, and the redistribution of land in the valley under Stroud's pressure was something that had mattered to him for a long time. 3 small operations had sold under duress in the past 5 years. Land that had been in families for a generation gone for prices that were technically fair and practically coerced, sold at moments of financial stress that Stroud had either engineered or waited patiently to exploit. 2 families were currently in loan agreements with his bank that carried terms no careful lender would have set, terms designed not to support the borrower, but to create the conditions for default. One man had signed over his timber rights in what he thought was a lease arrangement. What he had actually signed, according to Owen, was a permanent transfer buried in language that would have required a lawyer to untangle. None of this was secret exactly. People in the valley knew the shape of it. What they hadn't had was someone willing to stand in a public room and say it plainly, with specific facts to other people who could hear it. Vera wrote it down as Owen talked. When he finished, she had 3 pages of notes. The monthly landowners' meeting is Thursday, Owen said. He was not suggesting anything. He was simply providing information. I know, she said. She rode back to the ranch and spent that evening and the next morning going through what she'd written, organizing it, establishing what she could verify and what was only Owen's account. She was not going to say anything she couldn't stand behind. On Thursday morning, she put on the plain dark dress she'd brought from Nebraska, the one she wore for occasions that required her to be taken seriously, and rode into town. The Silver Fork landowners' meeting was held in the town hall, a building that was too large for its usual purpose and exactly right for the occasional gathering where everyone in the valley needed to be in the same room. Vera arrived 10 minutes before the start and found a seat near the back, which she did not intend to stay in. She counted 31 people in the room. Small operators, mostly men who ran cattle and grew hay and managed timber leases, men whose margins were narrow and whose margins had been getting narrower in recent years. A few of the older ones knew her by sight and nodded. Most just looked. Aldrich Stroud was at the front of the room with two men she didn't recognize, well-dressed and attentive. He had not seen her come in, or he had seen her and chose not to acknowledge it. She saw Cade 2 rows from the front on the aisle seat, sitting with the stillness that she associated in him with situations he was watching rather than acting in. He saw her, she knew he saw her, but he did not move. She was glad of this. The meeting came to order. There was procedural business first. Water rights, a road maintenance question, the usual matters. She listened and waited. When the agenda moved to the discussion of the upcoming fall contract season, she stood up. The room turned. Miss Hole, the meeting chair, began. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said evenly, "I have something relevant to the contract discussion. I'll be brief." She was brief. That was the point. She was not there to make a speech, or to tell a story, or to perform outrage. She stood at the back of the room and she said in plain and specific language, "Here is what Aldrich Stroud's bank has been doing in this valley for the past 5 years. Here is the Grantham family's timber rights transfer, which was represented to them as a lease. Here is the interest structure on the Pierce loan and what it actually means over a 10-year term. Here is the sequence of events preceding the Lowry property sale and how the pressure was applied." She named amounts. She named dates. She said nothing she could not support, and she did not say anything twice. When she finished, she said, "Last week, Mr. Stroud used my father's name in this town in a way that was meant to diminish my standing and my husband's. My father was Martin Holloway of Cedar County, Nebraska, who worked 31 acres of difficult land for 30 years and did not once misrepresent a transaction to another man. He died owing money he didn't have, which is a harder thing to manage than dying owing nothing. He does not deserve to be used as a tool in someone else's business strategy." She looked at Stroud. "I'm not here to make accusations that require a courthouse," she said. "I'm here to say what I know to people who have a right to know it before they sign anything this fall." She sat down. The room was quiet for a long moment. Stroud's face had the controlled quality of a man doing careful internal work. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "Mrs. Whitmore has characterized certain business arrangements in terms that the figures are accurate," said a man in the third row. Vera did not know his name. He was looking at Stroud with the expression of a man who had suspected something for a long time and had just had it confirmed. I can speak to the Pierce loan terms personally. My brother-in-law is Elias Pierce. A second voice from the left side of the room. And I was at the Grantham signing. I'll have my own lawyer look at those documents. Stroud began to speak again. He was good at this, she had expected he would be, and what he said was measured and plausible and directed at the general feeling in the room, rather than at specific facts. He was a man who had spent years managing rooms, but the room had shifted. She could feel it, the particular quality of attention that changes when people stop being uncertain about what they're looking at. Not a revolution, not a verdict, just a group of working people who had received information they intended to sit with, and who were now looking at Aldrich Stroud with slightly different eyes than they'd had when they came in. When the meeting broke up, two men sought her out before leaving the Pierce brother-in-law, and a rancher named Haskell, who ran a middle-sized operation on the south end of the valley. Both wanted to talk about what she'd said. She gave them Owen's name. She told them to consult their own lawyers before signing anything in the fall. She kept both conversations short. Outside, the September afternoon was cool and bright, the mountains already showing the first faint changes of the season along their upper edges, the aspens beginning their slow turn. Cade came out behind her after a few minutes. He stood beside her on the plank walk and looked at the street. "You didn't need me in there," he said. "No. I was there. I know you were." She looked at the mountain line to the east. It's the difference between being watched over and being witnessed. One of those I needed. The other I didn't. He was quiet for a moment, considering this. "I understand the difference." "Good." She started toward the rail where her horse was tied. Stopped. "He'll find another angle. Stroud. He won't stop." "He'll find another angle," Cade agreed. But he spent the last 10 years assuming that isolation was his best tool, that the people in this valley had no way to compare notes. He looked at her. That assumption is no longer solid. She mounted up, looked down at him. "I need a few more days," she said. "Not many, but a few. You have them." He looked up at her steadily. "As many as you need." She rode back along the valley road through the afternoon light and felt something in her chest that she was starting to recognize, not the relief of a burden put down, but the particular quality of ground found. The thing that happened when you discovered that what you were standing on was solid. Her mother arrived on a Saturday. No letter. No advance notice. Just a wagon coming through the gate in the early morning and Ruth Holloway sitting in it with her traveling bag, and the expression of a woman who has decided something and is not interested in discussing whether she should have decided it differently. Vera helped her down without speaking. They walked eventually to the fence line at the east edge of the property, the one that looked out toward the mountains. The morning air was sharp and smelled of turning leaves. September had arrived with conviction overnight, the way it did in the high country. "I could have written," her mother said. "You could have. I wanted to see your face." Vera looked at the mountains. And you look like yourself." Her mother said this plainly as a fact without decoration. You look like yourself in Nebraska, but differently. Here you look like yourself without being pressed down by something." Vera was quiet. "I knew some of what happened," her mother said. "Not all of it. Your father told me there was a man who had helped. Not who, not why. He said it was important that I not ask questions about it." A pause. "I didn't ask questions because I'd learned which things your father meant when he said they were important, and which things he just said. Did you know he wrote a letter to Fletcher about it? I suspected something. I didn't know the shape of it." Her mother turned to look at her. "Are you angry at him?" Vera thought about this. The real answer, not the first available answer. "I'm sad," she said finally. "He spent the last year of his life trying to protect me from something I could have handled myself. But he didn't know that. He only knew me as the person who had never been given the room to handle it. So he couldn't imagine that I would." She paused. "He was wrong about me. But he made the same mistake for the same reason he made most of his mistakes, because he loved me more than he understood me." Her mother looked at the mountains for a long time. "He said something to me the last winter," she said. "He said the only thing I regret about Vera is that I never found a way to tell her what I saw. He meant your capacity. He could see it, and he didn't have the language." She stopped. "Some men don't. It doesn't mean they didn't see it." Vera breathed out slowly. The cold morning air, the smell of frost on grass, the mountain light coming over the peaks. "I know," she said. Her mother put her hand through Vera's arm briefly, a gesture she had made perhaps 3 times in Vera's memory, and then withdrew it because Ruth Holloway was not a woman of demonstrative affection, and the gesture had said what it was meant to say. "This is a good place," her mother said, looking at the valley. "It is. Is he a good man?" Vera thought about August evenings in the study working through contracts. Thought about a Thursday when he'd said careless and it was mine, without asking anyone to soften it for him. Thought about a barn doorway, a book on a shelf, a man sitting in a low chair who hadn't needed her to speak to know that her presence was enough. "Yes," she said. "He is." On the 4th evening after the meeting, Vera went to the kitchen. It was late, well past 9, the house quiet around her. She set the kettle on and found the coffee and waited. And when the door opened and Kate appeared, she was not surprised. She was not sure which of them had expected to find the other there, but neither of them looked surprised. He poured himself a cup. She poured herself a cup. They sat down across from each other at the kitchen table where they had eaten dinner every evening for months, where Ida was usually managing the logistics of the meal, and Owen was occasionally present, and the table felt populated by the ordinary rhythms of a working household. At this hour, it was just the two of them and the lamplight and the sound of the wind picking up outside. "I'm going to stay," Vera said. He looked at her. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. Not because staying is easier than leaving. Not because my mother came and my brother came, and everyone has their own reasons they want me to stay." She held his gaze across the table. "Because I want to. Because this is a life that fits the shape I am, and I've been waiting a long time to find that. All right, he said, but I have conditions. He waited. I'm gonna pay back the money. Every dollar that went into my family's debts under your name. Not all at once, it'll take years, and I'll need your patience on the schedule. But I'll pay it back. She set both hands flat on the table. Not because I think you owe me an apology for paying it. You did what you believed was right, and I've thought about that enough to understand it. But because I need to stand here knowing the ground under my feet is mine. That's not negotiable. I accept that, he said immediately. No hesitation. And second, she looked at him steadily. The next time you're carrying something heavy about the ranch, about the past, about anything that involves both of us, you tell me. Not because I can fix everything. Not because I'll always have the right answer. But because I'm not interested in finding out years from now that there's something important you decided I didn't need to know. He met her gaze. I'll try. Not enough. A pause. Something moved in his expression. Not offense, not surprise. A kind of recognition. And beneath it, something that she thought might be the particular quality of relief that came to people who had been carrying things alone for a long time and had just been given permission to put them down. I will, he said. She read his face, the face she had been reading for months, now learning its language. He meant it. That was the thing about Cade Whitmore that she had understood from early in the first month. He did not say things he didn't mean. It was a quality that made him difficult and reliable in equal measure, and she had no interest in changing either part of it. All right, she said. She finished her coffee. He finished his. The wind moved through the eaves of the house in the familiar sound she had first heard on her second night. Here and now, no longer noticed except when she remembered to. She stood to go. At the door of the kitchen, she stopped. One more thing, she said. He looked up. The partnership papers. Before anything else. She watched his face. Equal ownership on the operational side. I want it on paper before we put anything else on paper. He looked at her for a long moment. Why that order? Because I need to know that whatever comes after is between equals, not a man and his wife. Two people who built something together, and both have the claim to show for it. He was quiet. She watched him think, not the performance of consideration, but the real thing, the kind that moved across a man's face when he was working something through, that actually cost him something to work through. Cade Whitmore, who had spent 15 years building everything he owned alone by the force of his own will and judgment, was sitting with the question of what it meant to say that half of it was someone else's too. Not the money in it. She had understood from early on that money was not how he measured things that mattered. The other question, the one about what he had built and who he had been while building it, and whether dividing that in half changed anything essential about either. Yes, he said. She went to bed. She lay in the dark for a while. Not the sleepless dark of the previous nights, which had been full of unresolved weight. This was a different kind of wakefulness, lighter, the kind that came when something important had been settled, and the mind hadn't quite caught up to the fact yet. Through the east window, the stars were out in the enormous Montana sky, more of them than she had ever seen in Nebraska. The kind of sky that made a person feel the appropriate scale of things. She thought about her father, about the letter he had written to a man he would never see again, asking him to give his daughter a fair chance at finding her own ground, about the imperfect architecture of his love, flawed in all the ways that a man who had never learned to say the direct thing was flawed and real in all the ways that mattered when you looked at what he had actually tried to do, rather than what he had failed to say. She thought, "I understand you now. It took me longer than it should have, and it cost both of us more than it needed to. But I understand you." She slept. The morning came in cold and clear, the first genuine autumn morning of the season, the sky the particular blue that only appeared after the first hard frost had stripped the air of its summer heaviness. Vera was in the barn before full light working with Rook, preparing him for the morning ride. The ranch was waking up around her in its ordinary rhythms. The sounds of Owen in the yard giving direction, the particular percussion of the operation starting its day. She heard boots on the barn floor, recognized the weight of them. Cade came in and set a second cup of coffee on the shelf beside Rook's stall, said nothing, began checking the cinch on his own saddle. She reached for the cup without looking at him. "I want to check the east pasture this morning," she said. "The grass hasn't come back the way it should have." "I know. I was going to ride out there today. Then we'll go together." She finished with Rook's girth strap and picked up the reins. He was already mounted. They rode out through the open barn doors into the cold blue morning. The valley spread out ahead of them in the light, the river and the mountains and the long grass, going gold in the early autumn, the whole of it large and indifferent. And for the first time since she had arrived in April, fully hers. Not because she had been given it, because she had stayed. There is a kind of man who keeps a promise by never mentioning it, not out of cowardice, not out of calculation, out of an understanding that some debts spoken aloud become chains, and that you do not honor a person by binding them even with something made of gratitude. Vera Holloway had needed 4 months to understand this about Cade Whitmore. What she understood on the other side of it was not a simple thing. It was not forgiveness exactly, or at least not only that. It was something more complicated and more durable. The recognition that the people who had loved her, her father, this man in different ways and for different reasons, had tried to give her the one thing she actually needed, and had been imperfect in their trying and had been right about what she needed anyway. Her father had looked at his daughter and seen someone who needed to find her own ground before she could trust the ground under anyone else. He had been right. Cade Whitmore had looked at a name on a piece of paper and seen a chance to honor a debt without creating a new one. He had been right and wrong about the timing and honest about both when it mattered. And Vera had come to a valley she hadn't chosen, in a life she hadn't designed, and had done the thing she had always done. She had worked with. What she found made herself essential to it, claimed it piece by piece until it was hers. The partnership papers had been signed before the week was out. Equal shares, her name beside his on the document, witnessed by Owen and Ida in the practical way of people who understood that some things deserved to be made official and then returned to immediately. There had been no ceremony, just two signatures and the sound of a drawer closing, and then Ida putting dinner on the table because the world kept moving, and there was work tomorrow. The passage money was still in the desk drawer of her room. She would return it to him. She would track down every dollar that had gone into her family's account, and she would replace it. Not in spite of him, but for herself. Because that was the kind of woman she was and had always been, and she had long ago stopped apologizing for it. That morning, riding east through the autumn grass, with the mountains ahead of them and the work of the day waiting, Vera Holloway thought about what her father had wanted for her. He had wanted her to find her own ground. She had found it. It looked like this.